you for joining us today. We're very excited that you all are here and get to hear from Dr. Palm-Foster. Let me do a couple moments of introduction. And first, thanks to Katie Fry and Amy Slocum for organizing the seminar series and continuing it throughout the semester. And we're very excited to welcome Dr. Leah Palm-Foster to the seminar series and hear about her work about how economic experiments can teach us about protecting the environment. For those who don't know Leah, if you haven't met her, you should, right? I know it's hard in our COVID world to meet people, but really the University of Delaware has been blessed to have Leah since coming as an assistant professor, graduating from Michigan State University. And we are very pleased to note that Leah has just been awarded tenure, and so she'll be moving to an associate professor coming the fall. So congratulations, Leah. Her work has really been phenomenal at looking at the interface of agro-environmental topics and working a lot with landowners in the Mid-Atlantic and throughout the country. Her work is noted in many national presentations and increasingly international presentations, as well as a scholar who really understands what it's going to take to get landowners to adopt more conservation practices and to persist with those practices over time. She's been leading the social dimensions pieces of Project WiCCED, and so we look forward to hearing about her talk today. So without further ado, we welcome you, Leah, and look forward to your talk. And if there's any questions or comments, you let us know how you'd like us to have those forwarded to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kent. That was a great introduction. I'm really happy to be speaking with all of you this morning, and I appreciate the time you all have taken to join me for this presentation. I'm very flexible with how you all want to bring questions to me during this time. You're welcome to interrupt, or you can hold them until the end. I'm really very flexible. So if a question jumps out and you just want to go ahead and ask it, please feel free to interrupt. I will say I have trouble keeping track of all of the things happening in Zoom, so I'm not going to be able to monitor the chat. So Katie, if you would monitor the chat, and if there's a burning question and you would like to interrupt me to ask it, please do so. Otherwise, if I see that little chat flashing, I'm just going to ignore it. So that's probably the best way to proceed. So today, my talk, so what can economic experiments teach us about protecting the environment, is going to focus on a little bit of talking about research towards the end. But when I was preparing for this seminar, I thought, well, we're likely to have a really interdisciplinary group of people at all different levels, right? From undergraduate students all the way up to folks that are really familiar with the research in Project WiCCED. And so there may be many of you who aren't as familiar with economic experiments, or maybe have been hearing us talk about them, but don't really understand what they are or the value that they can bring to the conversation. So what I'd like to do, let me make sure I'm on the right screen. Okay, what I'd like to do is I'd first like to provide some motivation and introduction for what we're talking about when we describe economic experiments and how they can be used to carefully test hypotheses about human behavior, and specifically about human behavior related to the environment and environmental management. And so I'll talk a little bit about different types of experiments that we can use and how they can reveal these insights about behavior and environmental decision-making. And then I'll specifically highlight a couple of projects just to provide some clear examples of how we use experiments in Project WiCCED. And then I want to end with highlighting some opportunities for us to work together in an interdisciplinary way. And we've already been doing this in many different projects, but I think there are even more opportunities ahead of us to really think carefully about how we link economic experiments with other types of research and modeling approaches to learn more about behavior, and particularly behavior at different scales. Okay, so that's how I'm going to frame the talk today. And so the first part, for those of you who are experimental economists or have a lot of familiarity here, will kind of be review, but I think it's also fun to just think about it in a different way. Uh, I won't spend a whole lot of time motivating why we care about behavior that influences the environment, because I think for this group, we all embrace this idea that we as individuals making decisions and our collective decisions have a huge impact on environmental outcomes. And we can be thinking about this in terms of producer decision making, for example, agricultural producers and how they decide to manage their agricultural lands and the impact that has on outcomes like water quality. We could be thinking about our willingness to invest in stream restoration in order to improve water quality, our use of plastic bags, our willingness as homeowners or residents to invest in conservation landscaping, like putting in rain gardens, or just our behavior in terms of recycling, right? Or our interest in using renewable energy sources. So all of these different behaviors collectively come together and influence our environment and natural resource management decisions. So what we need to do is we need to understand human behavior and how these decisions are made and what factors influence the decision making so that we can better understand how to support pro-environmental behavior. And so that's where economics comes in. I don't expect you to be really picking up any specific words here in this diagram. I just liked it because it showed all of the complexity in how we make decisions on a day-to-day basis. And at its core, economics is the study of human behavior under scarcity. We have scarce resources. A lot of times we think about economics in terms of money, but we can talk about economics and how we allocate our time, right? How we make trade-offs on a day-to-day basis about what we're going to spend time on and what's important to us based on what other opportunities we could have to spend our time on other activities. Right? Students decide every day, are they going to go to class on Zoom or are they going to go outside and go for a hike, right? This is a decision that we make. And so the study of economics helps us better understand all of these different types of behaviors. All right, so then what are economic experiments? Well, with economic experiments, we're using controls and treatments to investigate an outcome of interest. So that outcome of interest is usually related to a decision that is being made, right? And the key here is that with these experiments, we're using randomization to determine who's in a control group and who's experiencing some sort of treatment. Maybe this is information that is provided to someone, and we see how behavior changes depending upon whether you have the information or not, right? And so this control is important because it allows us to really isolate the effect of a treatment, right? So we observe choices that are made by individuals in these different groups, and we can really determine, well, for example, again, if that treatment was information, what is the impact of that information by comparing outcomes from the treatment group versus the control group? Right? So those of you in the natural sciences, you all are using experiments all the time, and it's a really the same idea, just applied to human behavior. And again, this randomness is really important because that also allows for isolating that effect, because we don't have to worry about all of these other factors that may influence behavior that we're not able to control for because of the fact that we've randomized in our control and treatment groups. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about our toolkit, because experimental economists can use different types of experiments. These experiments have different benefits, different costs, and they have different value in different contexts. So I'm going to show you some of the experiments and what they look like with photos, and then I'll summarize them at the end. But our toolkit includes different things. So we could be talking about a laboratory experiment with student participants, right? This is a really classic type of economic experiment, and it's really good to help test hypotheses that are derived from theory. The lab in that way serves as a test bed. We can also be trying to understand behavior at a fundamental level before we go out in the field working with real decision makers and adding in lots of context and complexity, right? In the lab, we have more control. So the treatments that we are applying and observing how behavior changes are just more streamlined, right? We don't have all of the complexity that we observe in the field to kind of influence the behavior that we're seeing, okay? So these lab experiments are often also cheaper, right? Because we're using student participants. It's easier to recruit students, and we can learn a lot before we move out into a field setting. Now, when we move out into a field setting, we can still be in very much a lab type space, right? This is an experiment that I conducted with landowners and farmers in Pennsylvania. And we call this an artifactual field experiment, or sometimes a framed field experiment, depending upon what you're doing. But we have people coming in, and it's a similar setup to those lab experiments with students. But now we have the real decision makers, and we're asking them to make choices based on providing different kinds of treatments or interventions and seeing how that impacts behavior. Right? Sometimes we're out in the field working with consumers, and often these experiments don't even look like work. They look like so much fun. This was one where we were doing an experiment talking about preferences for oysters from different locations and with different attributes. And so in these cases, you actually have people making real decisions about consumption, and they are consuming food products right there or taking them home with them. Another important point to make about experiments is this is what we call a revealed preference approach in economics, meaning that when people are making decisions, they are actually acting upon those decisions. So there's real money at stake, or they're really going to be implementing a behavior that they say they're willing to do, like this gentleman who is consuming an oyster after purchasing it, based on a treatment that he experienced through the experiment. And in the back there, you can see our mobile laboratory. This is our tuk-tuk, and this also helps us implement experiments in the field. Okay, you may be doing a framed field experiment with producers, trying to understand their preferences. Here, we were doing an experiment understanding preferences for different types of hybrid seed, depending upon characteristics of the bag, which provided signals about the authenticity and the quality of that seed. And so this was an experiment that was done with producers in Kenya, right? So these tools are very flexible and can be used to ask a variety of questions, okay? And sometimes you don't even, what we're observing doesn't even seem like an experiment because it's just people making decisions, right? So this is an example. You might have farmers making day-to-day decisions on their actual agricultural land based on an experiment about irrigation. So maybe they're getting different information about how their irrigation levels compare to neighbors versus farmers that don't get those kind of that comparison information. And we're seeing what is the impact of that comparison and that information that's provided. So here, what you observe is just day-to-day decisions on someone's farm, but those can be tracked back to look at how behavior changed or how behavior was different rather, if they had that information about the social comparisons. And sometimes we get really fancy and we actually want to know what's going on in people's brains. And so this is an example of an experiment that used an fMRI machine. And this is not my area of expertise. So if there are questions about this type of experiment, I'll direct you to Sean Ellis, who I see is on the call, who has done a lot of this really interesting cutting edge work. Okay. So experiments can be really fun. They look very different depending upon the question that's being asked. They're flexible. They have a lot of benefits, right? And a lot of advantages to understanding why people make the decisions they do. They can also be really tiring. So this is part of our research team from a couple of years back after a long day conducting experiments at UD's Ag Day, right? And they are exhausted because for 10 hours, they were running different types of economic experiments, trying to understand behavior about consumer preferences related to in the environment and about homeowner preferences related to what they were willing to do in their lawns to help protect the environment, and all sorts of really exciting questions. Okay. Oops. Okay, So again, I won't go through this table, but I just wanted to say highlight there are all these different types of experiments. They have benefits and costs, right, in different ways. So for certain research questions, we might look at one specific type of experiment because it's best suited to address that question and help us learn about behavior that matters for the environment. Okay. I will emphasize here, without going into too much detail, that the benefits and costs and the trade-offs that you're making when deciding on the different types of experiments, you can think about the level of control that you have, right, with those lab experiments with students having the most control versus the amount of context that you can put into the decision, right, and reflecting the real behavior that you would observe out in the real world, and how representative your participants are, right? Are you working with students who are not, going to be very representative of farmer behavior, or are you working with the farmers themselves, right? So we could add up all sorts of different types of experiments and put them in this type of 3D space along these three axes, and understanding the trade-offs that we're going to have to make in choosing one type of experiment over the other, and then decide what's best for the question we're asking. And so I'll pause here just to say, if you think this is really exciting and that it could have some applications for work that you're doing, I also encourage you to seek out more training on experimental economics. And for example, Kent Messer teaches a graduate level class on experimental economics. It's going on right now. So you could look for that in future years for those of you that are students. Or not, even if you're not a student, you could audit it. So that's a plug I'll make for that class. Okay, so that leads me to, before I jump into some specific research examples, I'll just wrap up this discussion about different types of experiments with, again, highlighting how they can be applicable in different ways. And I've put here the reference information for two really recent papers. I'm not even sure if these have been assigned to issues yet, but they are available online. And they're really great for understanding opportunities and barriers, right, for using economic experiments for answering policy relevant questions that can inform how we design programs and policies in agri-environmental settings. Okay, so that's the real focus of these papers, but they're very, very helpful in framing some of these issues. So again, when we think about applicability, when we can go to the lab and we can learn a lot about fundamental behavioral questions. We can test hypotheses derived from economic theory, right? But we sometimes worry that we may not have the external validity, meaning that the findings we have in the lab may or may not reflect the decisions that would be made by real decision makers when they have all of this context and their brains are being pulled in so many different directions because of all of the day-to-day kind of decisions that we're making in our lives. And so we can go to the field then to pull in all of that complexity and then better understand the decisions that we see people take on a day-to-day basis in the real world. Okay. And then we can also work closely with different organizations or agencies to actually design and embed experiments in their programs and policies, so that instead of just trying things in an ad hoc way, we could actually be trying different ways to present decisions to potential participants. And then we can be, with our controls and our treatments, really understanding the impact of those different strategies within our programs. So again, instead of being kind of ad hoc and just saying like, well, I think that worked, we can have real evidence, right? And that evidence-based policy making is very important and attractive because it really motivates what we do with our scarce program dollars, which are public money that we need to really be using carefully, right, in an effective way. And so evidence-based policymaking relies on tools like experiments to help inform what we're going to do, in the real world in these programs. Okay, so let's talk about some different kinds of examples and some ways that we use experiments. So one type of kind of behavioral insight that we have about how people make decisions is coming from our behavioral economics literature. And it's this idea of using nudges, or a term I've recently been thinking about, which I saw in the literature, is boosts, which are related to nudges. And that's a whole nother seminar in entirety to talk about the differences between those two. But it's this idea that the structure of the decision-making environment really matters, and the information that people have matters, and these things can influence decisions, and sometimes they could be influenced in pretty predictable ways, right? But we don't want to just assume that what we know from our kind of theoretical evidence base is just going to work when we take it out in different settings. We want to test these hypotheses, and so we can use experiments to do that. And we've seen a lot of successful examples in many different fields and different contexts, including some environmental contexts. So for example, many of you, if you have looked at your energy bill recently, you may have seen a comparison with how much energy you use compared to neighbors that are like you, right? Maybe they have a similar size home with a similar number of bedrooms, right? I see this all of the time. And I'll be really honest, I think, man, I need to cut back on my energy use because I'm consuming more, right, than my neighbors are. And so we look at this information, which is a social norming type of information, or a social comparison, to tell you how your behavior compares to others. And it can make us change what we're doing, right? I might say, I need to conserve a little bit more, right? Because I'm using too much. And so this is an example of work that has been done in experimental economics, and that they've actually tested the impact of these types of social comparisons.
So
Right?
Leah, I want to go back. Is that your actual bill there? Are you the one that's?
No,
Oh, okay.
that's not mine. This is something I found online. I should have taken my own, but I will say I have a whole nother house basically below my house, a whole apartment that's built out there. So I'm going to justify my usage. But
There you go. There you go.
that's another behavioral economics.
Mine right now is incredibly bad too, compared to my neighbors. And I'm like, I wonder if this is not like comparing my current use compared to my neighbor's historic use, right? And with COVID, my current use would be just so much more dramatically there. But like, I don't know how real time they're doing it. It could be like they're looking a couple years. It seems off, or maybe it's just the realities of life in our household. But the nudge is kind of depressing me here.
Yeah, sometimes it can be depressing. And that leads me to another point I can make, in that there's an increasing need to understand how these, what we call nudges, right? Or how information like this, a social comparison, how it influences behavior over time, right? A lot of these studies have looked at relatively short time periods and how our behavior is influenced. But when we really care about persistent pro-environmental decision-making, in which we are consistently making decisions that provide improved outcomes. So it is important to think about that as we move forward. Okay. So this is a really nice framework that was developed by Paul Dolan and his co-authors. It's published in the Journal of Economic Psychology. And I think it's helpful to categorize some of these behavioral insights that we have about how people make decisions. And for the sake of this presentation, I don't have time to kind of go through and explain each of these different categories, but I'm going to highlight a couple of them, and I'm going to relate them to agri-environmental decision-making, meaning how farmers and land managers make decisions in agricultural landscapes that influence environmental outcomes. And then, if you're interested in thinking more about this framework and how it can apply to many different settings, you can seek out this paper, this 2012 paper. Okay. So I'll tell you, I'm going to highlight a couple of these. I'm going to highlight commitment, which is an insight that tells us that we seek to be consistent with public promises. And so if we can make upfront commitments, we're more likely to follow through with them. And then also ego, right? We often act in ways that make us feel better about the decisions that we're making. So that is another behavioral insight we can tap into. And then another I'll highlight is salience. Our attention is drawn to what we think is relevant and novel. And so I'll talk about how I've tested some salience insights in my research. But before we jump right into that research, I wanted to share, I found a couple of other papers that I think further motivate how these insights about behavior have direct impacts on the environment. And also they help us motivate how economic experiments can be used to test these insights in different contexts. So this recent paper, or relatively recent paper in Conservation Letters, did a really nice job. They not only talked about some of the nudges, like I've mentioned before, and showing these social comparisons, but they also linked to both financial and social incentives that we get, and talked about how these have implications in different environmental decision-making contexts, including water and energy use, like I've already mentioned, but also littering behavior and land conservation. So I thought this was another really nice paper that I wanted to direct you all to if you find this topic of interest and want to learn more. And then another, so this is a 2018 paper in the Frontiers of Ecology and Environment. And in this paper, they were taking some of these insights. These don't directly align with MindSpace, which is the framework I just showed you, but they are very much overlapping. You know, you can see commitments here and salience, and they show for different types of decision-making, like land management, meat consumption, transportation choices, waste production, right? Like they show if the intervention shows promise in being able to influence these types of environmental decisions, if there's mixed evidence, or studies that have found no effect for different types of decisions. So I thought this was also a really nice framework, and I wanted to share this paper with you all. Okay, so that leads me to what kind of research have we done in Project WiCCED to further understand decision-making related to improving water security in Delaware, and using Delaware really as just a study site that reflects decision-making in this context in many other locations and settings. So something I think about a lot is how our agricultural decision-making influences water quality, right? This is a global problem, but we have many examples of these types of problems in the United States, right? For us in the Mid-Atlantic, we think a lot about water quality in the Chesapeake Bay and how excess nitrogen, phosphorus, and different sediments influence that water quality. We would have similar conversations if we were in the Great Lakes region and also in the Mississippi River Basin, thinking about the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. I've always thought this is a powerful comparison, and looking at the percent of land area in crop production, with those dark green areas being 75% or more of the acres are in crop production, and looking at that Mississippi River Basin, that watershed, and comparing it and looking over here at some of these water quality problems, right? Looking at that Gulf of Mexico, the hypoxic zone, and also we do have intense crop production and animal production in our area with poultry production that has implications for water quality in our region as well. Okay, and so in the United States, we rely heavily on voluntary conservation programs in which we provide economic incentives to farmers to improve the land management decisions that they make. So adopting what we call best management practices, right? This could be something like putting in a cover crop over the winter to help take up excess nutrients and keep the soil in place, or it could be putting in a buffer strip, right, to help filter runoff water before it reaches the waterway. Many examples of these best management practices that farmers could adopt. And we spend $6 billion a year at the federal level on these types of incentive programs. So program administrators are constantly asking, how can we make these program dollars go further, right? What do we need to understand about behavior to get more enrollment, to get the enrollment of the practices that are going to be most cost effective in handling these water quality problems, and getting the right people to the table, right? We need those those land managers who influence sensitive areas of the watershed also to be willing to step up and adopt such practices. So there's a lot of interest in testing insights from behavioral economics with economic experiments to understand how we can design these programs in more effective ways. So one of those insights that I'll highlight first are the commitment and ego insights. And for me, these are very related. And so, for example, we have examples of stewardship recognition programs across the United States, including in our area, right? This is a brochure from the Maryland Soil Conservation Districts in which they talk about a farm stewardship certification program that they have. And in these programs, farmers commit to doing certain practices, taking specific actions to help reduce the nutrient runoff moving into different water bodies, and also to provide other environmental benefits on their land. And then they are publicly recognized for these actions, right? Maybe they get a sign, they are recognized in the newspaper, they perhaps go to a ceremony, or maybe are getting awards to help acknowledge and provide credible signals that they have taken these actions and they are being good environmental stewards. And these are very interesting programs that I think hold a lot of potential, both to tap into commitment and ego, but also to over time change our social norms. So to change, our expectations of people and how they manage their agricultural lands. So I was really interested in these programs, and several years ago I thought, well, it would be interesting to test how these programs influence behavior when you can provide environmental benefits in different ways. So you can adopt costly practices that help abate pollution. You could also reduce inputs, right? You could change your nutrient management in terms of how you apply commercial fertilizers. You could reduce the rate of those fertilizers. You could change timing. But we have different decisions that could be made to influence these environmental outcomes. And I was interested in understanding how these stewardship recognition programs and the social kind of pressures that come with them influence people's behavior in terms of their management, different types of management decisions. So we actually, I was just highlighting some parts of the brochure which talk about recognizing farmers and providing different benefits. But so first, I tested some of these questions in a lab experiment, right? So in the lab experiment, we didn't come into this experiment with student participants and telling them that they should pretend to be farmers. Instead, we took away that context of the agro-environmental decision making, and instead just explained to them that they were managing a firm, and we provided them with information about this firm that they were going to manage in the experiment, and told them about the different decisions they could make in the experiment and how that would have pollution impacts, right? And so through that experiment, we tested how the decisions about their production decisions and their technology adoption decisions, we looked at how those changed when they could signal the adoption of a pro-environmental technology. And that signal was very simple. They got to put up a green flag, which indicated that they had actually adopted this technology, and they had to be responsible for the cost of doing so, right? So there was real dollars being exchanged in this experiment based on the profits of the firms that these student participants were managing and the decisions that they made for those firms. So if they took a costly action and adopted a technology that would reduce pollution, they could put up their green flag. And then there were also treatments in which we applied different types of social pressure. So for example, we had different types of messengers. We had their peers, and we also used UD, our school mascot, right, to come in and respond to the outcomes of pollution generated by these firm level decisions, right? So again, student participants were managing these firms in the experiment. They were making decisions that resulted in levels of pollution, right? And then we could have the social pressure being these different types of messengers, then responding to those pollution outcomes. And here you see pictures of them being very sad and distraught and disappointed because there was excessive pollution based on the decisions that these student participants were making. And through this experiment, we actually found that participants were much more likely to choose a pro-environmental technology when they could signal that stewardship action. So when they could show the other people in the group that they were taking that action, that they were more willing to pay the cost of that technology, which reduced pollution in the experiment. It also reduced their profits in the experiment, again, because it was a costly decision to make. But we saw more and more people doing that. So that's an example of how we can use a lab experiment to test some basic questions about how people make decisions. Again, here we don't have the rich agri-environmental context. In order to have that, we would then take this experiment or a version of this experiment and move it into the field, working directly with agricultural decision makers. Okay. And just as a side note, I didn't highlight this result, but we didn't find robust impacts of these different social pressures on the behavior. It really seemed that the signaling was the key, that credible signal through that green flag, but we didn't see a lot of amplification of pro-environmental behavior or pollution reducing behavior based on the addition of social pressure. Okay, so that's an example of being in the lab. And then more recently, I conducted an experiment where I actually went out and was in a lab-like setting, right? We were in a room with computers. These participants were making decisions on a tablet, similar to how students were making decisions on a computer in the lab. But here we were working directly with either farmers or rural landowners. And we were investigating how willingness to invest in stream restoration is influenced by information about the magnitude of erosion problems on someone's land that they manage, and also the causes of those erosion problems. So in this experiment, we increased the context, we enriched the experiment with context about agricultural landscapes. We showed pictures of maps of real parcels that had a stream or river running through them. And then in certain treatments, we told farmers about the erosion levels on these parcels and how they compared to typical erosion rates in that area, right, in that landscape. And then for other farmers, they got a map, but they didn't get all of that rich information about those erosion rates. Right? And so we wanted to see how that influenced behavior. And so the key takeaway from this experiment was that landowners were more willing to invest if they were given information about erosion rates and they controlled parcels with high levels of erosion, right? This is kind of similar to those results that we saw in the energy sector, right? With providing social comparisons about how we use energy in our homes, in that if you were using too much compared to others, you're willing to cut back. Here it's similar, but a little bit different. Basically what we were finding is that if people thought they could have a real impact because there was a lot of erosion happening on their land, and so their behavior would reduce erosion more so than others, they were more willing to contribute. They were really more willing to contribute to the stream restoration project. And so we thought that was really interesting. And I wanted to also highlight that sometimes you can do an experiment with landowners and or the real decision makers and students and find pretty similar results. So in this project, we actually conducted the same experiment with student participants, right? To see, in part, one of our goals was to see how behavior would compare between students and farmers. And our result in general was that students were acting in a very similar way to the farmer rural landowner participants. And this is actually a finding that is reflected in many other studies, and that often we see that that students can predict the decisions of the stakeholders or real decision makers in the field for these kind of basic behavioral questions, right? So that was really interesting. I meant to put the reference information on this slide. I apologize, I didn't do this. This is a new paper that's been published in Environmental Research Letters just this past month, in which we describe the outcomes of both the student and the landowner experiments related to stream restoration. And so again, we're just comparing the investments in the stream restoration project, depending upon if you had a low erosion parcel, kind of a higher erosion parcel, or if you were in a hotspot parcel, right? And so we see as the level of erosion increases, there's an increased contribution, because people, again, have that greater sense of potentially responsibility, and also knowing that they can have greater impact. So I apologize for forgetting to put that reference on there, but please look it up. We're really proud of that paper. And this is joint work with Lindsay Kelly, who is a master's student who is now graduating from our department. Okay, so I'm going to end on a message. This is actually not my framework. When I was looking for fun images to put in my presentation, I found this framework by the University of Oxford Institute for New Economic Thinking. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. It makes me think of Project WiCCED. Because basically what you see here is that there's multidisciplinary perspectives and also input. And then we have different kind of novel economic methods and tools and frameworks that can help us develop new insights. And these insights kind of feed back in and help us to continue this productive research cycle. And then we also have the influence of policymakers and society and what we value and what our goals are, contributing to different challenges, right? So if I were going to add something here, I'd add environmental challenges to our economic and social challenges, because they're all interrelated, also helping to drive insights. And so there's this kind of feedback between the two. And I really have enjoyed being involved with Project WiCCED, because I think that we have been able to do some really exciting work, and we're continuing to plan more experiments that link novel methods, including economic experiments, agent-based modeling, coupled natural human systems modeling. And I think that pulling together our interdisciplinary toolkits and our frameworks and ways of thinking really help us to advance our understanding of behavior, and specifically how people make decisions that impact our environment. And all of this is moving us towards a place where we can hopefully see improved decision-making and better environmental outcomes moving into the future, which I think we would all agree is going to be really critical and important for thinking about our kind of sustainable management of our resources and environment. So I will end on my key takeaway slide, which is the exact slide you saw at the beginning, and I'll stop there for questions or discussion.
Well, thanks, Leah. This was really great. And we do have some time for questions. If people want to put them in the chat or just throw them out, go ahead and do so.
I must have explained it so well that there are just no questions. Everyone is just, they've got it. This is what happens every Tuesday and Thursday in my classes too. My students just perfectly understand me. Oh, I see the chat box lighting up a little. Now I have the capacity to look at it, so I will.
Oh, you're getting thanked.
Are there experiments that we can participate in right now? Well, Kent will have to answer this question for us. I know his students are planning some really cool experiments for their class. They're learning to do experiments. I'm not sure if any of those will be open to the public, but I'm teaching a graduate class, so I have time to talk with many of the students that he has in his course, and I know they're excited about those projects and doing some really neat things.
Well, we are, and I'm going to I'm going to defer that. I'm going to let you go take John's question here, and then I'll follow up on that in terms of experiments of what, and maybe we can talk about how COVID's affected your work. But why don't you get John's question here about any chance you could elaborate on your agent-based models?
Oh, thanks, John. That's a great question. I'm actually scrolling through the participant list to see if Yao is here. Okay, so I'm really excited about opportunities to link what we learn from economic experiments with agent-based models, and also to connect and link the natural systems models into this modeling framework as well. So Yao and I, along with other colleagues that are connected with Project WiCCED, have been engaging in conversations trying to figure out how we can move forward with this type of linkages. And our idea is, which I shouldn't act like it's never been done before. This coupling has been done before, but there's not that many examples, so it's still pretty novel. But the idea is that you can take what we learn about behavior through the experiment, and then use that knowledge to parameterize this agent-based model, which then allows you to think about behavior and introducing different kind of heterogeneity within decision makers, and understanding how that behavior would scale up and would potentially lead to outcomes, different types of outcomes. For example, we might want to know about irrigation decision making, and then we might learn something about how people make irrigation decisions in different risky scenarios. So, there's a risk of salinization of their irrigation wells, and how those risks influence behavior. But then we actually can, what we want to do is take that knowledge, incorporate it in an agent-based model, and then be able to model that behavior and how it evolves over time and in different settings, and see what that would do to the system and to our kind of larger scale outcomes that we would be interested in. So stay tuned, because we are in the midst of putting together a proposal to do this kind of work, in the future. So something we're very excited about.
So I'll be your moderator here. We have a nice question here from Pei about nice talk, Leah. Thank you. I was wondering how honest people are in your experimental setting, and how well you can extrapolate your experimental findings to the larger society. And are there corrections that you would apply? Thanks.
Yeah, that is a really good question. So I have a couple thoughts going through my head. So first of all, a benefit of economic experiments is that people are making decisions and actually following through in some way. So let me give you an example to tell you how that would work, right? And I'm going to compare it to another type of method we have as economists called stated preference, in which people just have to say something, but they don't have to follow through with it. So I'm going to use an example of telling me about your willingness to pay to put in a rain garden in your home, right? I could send out a survey and I could just ask someone that question, and they would give me an answer, and we would wonder if there was some kind of bias in that answer because it's a hypothetical decision, they don't have to follow through, are they being truthful, etc. Versus I could conduct an experiment and I could actually have people indicating their willingness to pay and actually needing to follow through with that decision, or a subset, right? Could be following through with that decision. So actually it helps us feel more confident in the decisions people are making, because there's real implications in terms of money or actions that are being taken in response to what they're saying they would do in the experiment. So that said, I do think we sometimes may have concerns about behavior in experiments if the stakes in the experiment are really small, but they're reflecting behavior that would have a lot higher stakes in reality. I think about this a lot with experiments about agricultural decision making, because in a lab setting or even in the field with decision makers making decisions in an economic experiment activity, sometimes those stakes are small. They might be working with, in the field, $100 for the economic experiment for that day. And while that's important, and they don't want to be, make foolish decisions and lose $100, that doesn't come anywhere close to the kind of money that's on the line when they go back and make real decisions in their operation. So for me, that is part of the value of pairing different kinds of experiments so we can compare lessons learned in the lab and then move into the field in which people are making these real decisions with real money and big stakes on the line, and understanding the behavior that they're exhibiting in those cases. So it's certainly something that we have to be cognizant about and careful with how we design our experiment and how we choose what kind of experiment is most appropriate for the research questions that we're asking.
Well, I might just throw in on that and build on that if I can, Leah. I think the correction is an interesting question, right? We just don't know. If we're talking about experiments in policy making, it lags behind experiments on vaccines or other types of things that used to not, medicine didn't used to be tested with randomized controlled trials, and now we do it all the time. We're still getting the process of getting policies to be tested with randomized controlled trials so that we can be learning as well. And so we don't quite know to what degree laboratory discoveries need to be corrected. One of the things I'm going to give a shout out to Leah. She's part of a group that is just got funded through the Robert Woodruff Foundation to look at down in Georgia to apply some work on groundwater use and look at lab experiments and see to what degree that can model water withdrawals in the Flint River Basin, and then use that for field experiments to test it out with large scale $500,000 of incentives out there to see if that can help preserve endangered species and reduce the tension between ag and the environment. And so that might give us a better chance to do some corrections, right? If we have lab experiments that help simulate it with students, maybe some non-farmer adults, and then actual farmers out in the Georgia area. There just needs to be more studies out there to see what corrections need to be applied and when they need to be applied. Leah, can you talk about how COVID's impacted your work? I mean, you showed lots of pictures earlier about beautiful field experiments and the staff that you had that ran them and all that. How has that worked how has that impacted your work here with Project WiCCED over the last year?
Yeah, so it certainly has had some big impacts. The experiment that I shared about stream restoration decision making, I showed you the pictures of the experiments that we ran in Pennsylvania with rural landowners. We actually had all 5 sessions lined up to run that experiment, an extended version of that experiment with Delaware farmers and landowners. And we had recruited everybody. All the sessions were set up. Lindsay Kelly did a fantastic job. She'd even organized the catering for all of them. And that was at the beginning of March in 2020. And they all had to be canceled. And so that was quite sad and painful to have to cancel all those sessions. And this has happened for a number of experiments that were planned around that time. We just can't do in-person work in that way. So I was extremely proud though, because we were very adaptive in being able to take those experiments, put them online. We decided not to run them with the rural landowners online, but that's the student work that I shared with you was kind of our plan B, right, of the work that we did to keep the project moving forward. Now we have student data, and when we're able to meet in person again, we'll be able to run those sessions with the rural landowners as originally planned. And so that's been that's an example of something that's just happened with a number of projects and having to adapt, move online, think creatively about how we can still engage with our participants. So we've done that in a number of cases, and also conducted some surveys, some online and mail surveys in the past year, one of which had an experiment embedded into it that was about stormwater management decisions of suburban and urban homeowners, and thinking about how different treatments and different information influence their willingness to install rain gardens and conservation landscaping. So we've learned a lot, and it's still been a very productive and exciting year, but there were certainly some disappointments along the way.
Great, thanks. I think we have probably time for one question. Tina, did I override you at one point? Tina, do you have a question?
That's okay, Kent. I absolutely, I have so many things to say, Leah. Thank you so much for this talk, because to be honest, I think I would have really enjoyed seeing this a few years ago when we first started Project WiCCED. It would have been very nice. I mean, you covered everything, and I think all of my questions from back then would have been answered. So anyways, a beautiful talk. The thing I was thinking about, and I'm so excited about the idea of agent-based modeling and some of the economic experiments. And one thing I keep thinking about, and I know this is not agriculture, this is more about, residences along the beach shoreline and so forth, but I keep thinking maybe taking some of our smaller communities, so it's kind of a specific, each different community has its own little problems, but maybe looking at that from a perspective of if a policy was introduced to enhance a possibility for retreat or some other scenario, if we introduce the different policies, how would they react? What would be the outcome of that population? And is there a chance at some point we could begin to understand what is the response of the people there, so that we can then begin to build a better model, so that as a policy change does go into place, we can begin to model that behavior a little bit better and use it for future research. So I don't know if I explained that well, but just that
no,
idea.
you explained it. You explained it beautifully, and I was just checking the participant list here. I'm so glad you brought it up. And actually, we need to talk, because we are planning research that is like really aligned with what you're wanting there. So I'm looking, Christina McGranigan and Laura Paul, and then a team, AR Siders. So a team of us are coming together to put together a proposal to do really similar work to what you were just describing, and understanding decision making around coastal retreat and accepting buyouts, home buyouts. So yeah, we should chat, because that's definitely something that can be done with economic experiments, and if you have ideas, we'd love to hear them.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, we're right at 12 o'clock. And so I appreciate everyone's time and attention. And so we will thank everyone. If you want to stick around for a couple more minutes, probably Leah might have a couple more moments to talk. But again, thank you for participating today in the seminar. Be well.